Richard Cook is a former federal government analyst who was one of the key figures in the investigation of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. In 1985, he went to work for NASA as the lead resource analyst for the Space Shuttle solid rocket boosters, external tank, and Centaur upper stage, if anyone knows what that means. I do not. Cook's first assignment led to his writing a memo on engineers' concerns that flaws with the solid rocket booster O-ring seals could cause the shuttle to blow up. In 1986, after the Challenger disaster, he disrupted a NASA cover-up when he provided his memo along with other documents on the hazards of the O-rings to the New York Times. Before joining NASA, Cook worked as an analyst for the U.S. Civil Service Commission, for the Food and Drug Administration, and for the Jimmy Carter White House. Cook left NASA to become an analyst with the U.S. Treasury Department in 1986. There he developed and taught training courses on policy analysis and led project teams on financial policy and organizational restructuring. He retired from the federal government in January 2007 and works today as a writer, lecturer, and consultant. Writings of Cook's that I've read cover topics from the militarization of space to a basic income guarantee and monetary reform, including a serious proposal for the federal government to print more money and give it away, though presumably not all to Halliburton. His website is Richard Cook, Richard, C-O-O-K, richardcook.com, and we're pleased to welcome him.
Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate being here, and thanks to Garda and Gwen for asking me. It's been a pretty busy year and a half since I retired from the government, but I want to take you back a little bit in my own life, give you a little bit more background about why I'm here, where I'm coming from. In 1964, I entered Yale University as a scholarship student. Now, my family were New Dealers. My mother grew up in poverty in Montana during the Great Depression. Talked to her about it a couple days ago. She's 85 years old. She's reminiscing. I said, "You didn't have electricity?" She said, "No." "You didn't have a phone?" She said, "No." But when I went to high school and boarded in Missoula, they had all of those things, and that started me off on a life where I swore I was never going to go back to poverty again. And she got out and she married my dad. He was in the Navy. Eventually we ended up in Virginia. And a lot of people who live in Virginia end up working for the federal government, as I did. But my trip to Yale was not really very successful because in 1960, I was a 14-year-old kid giving out flyers for John F. Kennedy. And a big event in my town where I was living, it was in Williamsburg, Virginia, was when Bobby Kennedy came one night and gave a speech at the Williamsburg courthouse. And there weren't even lights out there. They were just, I think they had car lights or something lighting up the front of the courthouse. And Bobby Kennedy gave one of the most moving speeches I'd ever heard in my life. And from that point on, I felt that my career was going to have something to do with government. So I went to Yale. I was on scholarship. But by then, of course, the Kennedy assassination had taken place, and I probably don't have to tell you how that affected me. And by 1964, when I went into Yale, Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment, had come out, and already it was pretty clear that this was a conspiracy and a cover-up, and the people involved with the federal government somehow had something to do with it, although, of course, we didn't know much then. We don't know a whole lot more now, but we do know that something terrible had happened. So I left Yale because it was pretty clear that I was in training to become one of those who was going to help run the American empire. And I didn't want to do that. So after traveling around, including a trip to Peru, where I got a very close-up look at Latin American poverty, and the difference between the way the Americans lived behind those brick walls covered with broken glass so no one would climb over it, and the people who were living down in the slums. I came back and I went to college in my hometown. I went to the College of William and Mary, and of course that's where Thomas Jefferson went to college, and you remember him. He was the guy who said all men are created equal. which we had forgotten. So anyway, after I left William and Mary, I did go up to Washington, and I worked for 32 years in the federal government, and I also taught school for a couple of years. I taught high school history. And David has given you the background about what then became the big event in my life, which was the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986. This was after I had worked in the Carter White House. I'd seen the Reagan Revolution come in and take place. I saw what was happening as the American empire took giant steps forward during the 1980s. And there I was in NASA working what I thought was a rather humble job as a resource analyst for the Space Shuttle program, when suddenly one day Challenger blew up. And as David said, I had been told by the engineers I was working with why and how that was going to happen. And when the cover-up began, I felt like this was something that I couldn't exactly go along with. So I did become the leaker of the O-ring papers. And the reason that the world knows, including all of you here, what happened, or at least on the surface what happened, you know that the engineers warned the night before Challenger was launched not to do it because it could blow up because it was so cold and the O-rings wouldn't seal. Well, the reason all that came out was because of the whistleblowers, because of myself, because of the Thiokol engineers who testified that they had warned not to do it, because of Dr. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize laureate who was the whistleblower on the Presidential Commission, and because of Chief Astronaut John Young, who began sending his own memos to the newspapers about what a travesty it had been and how NASA had ignored all indications that they were flying a very flawed system.